A guy came up to me the other night, right? And he was like, who's your favorite artist? And like most people do when they ask a question, he didn't really care about my answer and proceeded to tell me what he thought the true answer was. And he continued about his struggle to recognize who he said was the greatest of all time. He said, is it Shakespeare? Is it Frost, Picasso, Michelangelo? Is it the Beatles, Rembrandt, Michael Jackson, Beethoven? And he went on and on and on about who he thought was the greatest, not recognizing even his infrastructure to answer that question was misled and outdated. And so finally, I kindly smiled and said, okay, sir, you asked me who is the greatest of all time. Now you tried to share yours, so let me share mine, because there's no debate about who is the greatest, because all those other artists you mentioned, yeah, the greatest made them. And see, this artist, he's a beast, a lion, the name above names. You don't even realize it, but you encounter his art every day, and he deserves all of the acclaim. He deserves all of the fame, because all other artists pass away, but he remains. Oh, by the way, his name is God, Yahweh, Creator, your Maker. He's infinitely creative, sir. There is no one greater. And I can tell it looks like you're starting to get mad at me, but don't be jealous just because your favorite artist might bend words and my favorite artist bends galaxies. See, in the palm of his hand, he holds all the sand, the author of life, when he whispered, let us make man. See, what if I told you that you are God's poetry? You were created because someone else was creative. See, long ago he picked up his eternal paintbrush, dipped it in his glory, placed us in his story, and said, they will live for me. And I know it sounds outlandish, but we're not the product of random chances. And in fact, we're not even the vine. We're actually the branches. In the same way we're not the artist, we're actually the canvas. Because in an instant, God started to make art, shaped you uniquely and beautiful, individual from the start, and he touched the canvas of flesh and said, this one is better than the rest. I'll give him so much of my image, so even when they're hot off the press, you can still see the steam of my breath. And so he crafted and he made every arm and leg, ligaments, tendons, muscles, blood vessels, veins, arteries. He said, they're gonna have a part of me. And about that time, the guy butted back in and said, that sounds good and all, but I'm wretched and filthy. God won't use me, will he? And I said, see, that's what's awesome about God. No matter what we've done, he can still use us. Even though other artists, once they have broken equipment, they start to make excuses, God instead doesn't refuse us, and neither does he accuse us. He redeems us in Jesus, promises never to lose us. So stop saying that you're dirt. Stop saying you're scum of the earth. You ought to be careful about how you talk about someone else's work. Because if we've trusted in Jesus, we can stop saying we're filthy. All that is anyways is just pride clothed in false humility. If we only believed that we're truthfully created in his likeness, then we'd stop saying we're wretched, filthy, shameful, guilty, but instead knowing if we've trusted Jesus, we're righteous. Don't you see we're drawn to repentance because of his kindness? So how dare you call yourself worthless when he says you're priceless? But see, the best part is, since God is ultimately for God, he'll get glory out of you, whether you like it or not, because even temple ruins point to an architect, even if the temple is shot. And all I'm saying is that he's behind it all. So why do we insist on giving him no credit at all? He's the one that gave Van Gogh the imagination that changed the face of painting. Tell me, who else is responsible for Mozart being able to compose at age 5 without formal training? See, he made the fingers that Beethoven used to make art on the keys. For Pete's sake, he made Stevie Wonder, one of the best musicians of our time, and he couldn't even see. And that's why, in the same way that our lives are borrowed time, this poem is borrowed lines, because the most ridiculous statement we could ever say is that this poem is mine, because we're not self-sustaining. No, we're not self-creating. Technically, nothing we do is original. We're just imitating, and that's not a diss. All I'm trying to say is this: even our own creativity is nothing more than an outflow of his. And so I'll end with this. You know that quote about giving credit where credit is due? Well, if that's true, it's about time we give God his rightful credit too, because he's a God in the business of making old things new. And here's the truth: he's not through with making a masterpiece of you.
Pick up your pen and write a song. Lift up your voice and sing along. Raise your bow and play an anthem to our King. Bring all your paintings and your poems, cast them down before the throne. You are the maker's handiwork, a living masterpiece.
I was watching a movie this week. It was a weird movie. But you know, it was a plane movie. Y'all ever watch movies on the plane?
Yes.
Yes. Well, when you're on a 10.5-hour flight, you watch 5 movies.
Or you sleep.
Or you sleep. I only slept on the way there. I didn't sleep on the way back. I just watched a bunch of movies. And there was this movie, I can't even remember the name of it. It was this weird movie about this like middle-class woman whose husband dies of a heart attack and then she pretends he goes missing.
It's breaking news in Yuba County.
There we go. And it's a weird movie. It's a weird movie, so don't hold me accountable if you watch that movie, because it's not a recommendation, it's just a story. And we're watching this movie, and this woman, she's a pretty beaten down. Her husband doesn't really treat her well. And she's, every day she goes to the grocery store, she's doing her daily errands, and she's got her headphones in. And she's repeating, I am worthy, I am love. She goes, you know, I am strong, right? And it's funny because she tells everybody, you know, she'll be like, oh, I just, you know, what happened after your husband died? She's like, well, you know, I didn't know he was dead. I you know, we were supposed to go out to dinner and then I felt tired, so I went upstairs and I did my affirmations and I went to sleep. And everyone's like, what are affirmations? She's got her iPod listening to these, I am worthy, I am strong, probably I am independent. It wasn't a Christian affirmation. It was more like maybe a little bit Christian. Like if you're familiar with Brene Brown, I'm sure it was like somewhere in that realm of things. And Brene Brown is a Christian, but and the reason I bring that up is just because I think sometimes we're so used to songs that kind of carry from beginning to end a whole new thought. You know, they tell a story from beginning to end. Well, a lot of times, and I know the subject of whether we do contemporary or somewhere between contemporary and hymns or hymns is actually kind of a weird debate. It's something that we're still always talking about, and that's okay. We should always be talking about things. But sometimes, hear me out here, sometimes these songs that repeat themselves over and over are doing it for a reason. When we listen to Holy, 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 what word does it say? 3 times every single refrain? Holy, Holy, Holy. And what's that trying to teach us?
Holy, God is holy.
God is holy, right? And so when this song says, Holy, there is no one like you, there is no one beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder, show me who you are, and fill me with your heart. Lead me in your love to those around me. I think we sang that at least 10 times during that song. But just like that woman in the movie, here in this church service, that should be our affirmation. That should be teaching us who we are and who God is. And that's the song's goal. It's not just a song that repeats itself because the artist couldn't come up with any other lyrics. Like modern pop music. It's a song that is intentionally repeating the things that the artist or the writer is trying to teach us about God. And so the reason I bring that up, and I completely understand that I come from a different place when it comes to worship, because I grew up in a large non-denominational church of 10,000 people, right? I grew up during the movement of the pole barn church. How many remember the pole barn church movement? Anyone know what I'm talking about when I say that? So somewhere around like the late 80s, early 90s, really mid to late 90s is when they really all started. There was I call it the pole barn church movement. I don't know if other people call it that, but that's what I call it. It's this time where pastors and ministers were getting together and trying to create churches that would draw in non-believers. The seeker-friendly movement, if you're familiar with that, if you've heard that before, they're trying to create an atmosphere that's more like a concert or a keynote speaker event more than it is a church service, or at least, more than it is a traditional church service. And my church was kind of part of that. It started in 1997, and it met in a hotel lobby for a while, a hotel gala area meeting space. and then they became a pretty big church, and at one point it was like the 6th fastest growing church in the country. But that's where I come from. And it took me a long time for me to get okay with hymns, right? It took me to go to Cedarville with the Southern Baptists and then work at a Southern Baptist church that was contemporary, which means we sang hymns and had an acoustic guitar playing. And then into the Disciples, where all we do is sing hymns. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But my point is that regardless if we're singing, oh, I'm not on this yet. Don't show them the pretty church.
Too late.
Go back one. Oh no, now we've got 4 blobs. My point is this morning, and I'm sorry I'm spending some time on this, but it's important, and it's something that I've been thinking about recently. It doesn't matter if it's a hymn or it's a contemporary song. There's a reason that the artist wrote those words. Yes, it gets the message across, whether it be a story or repetition. And if you will open your mind and your heart to guitars in a song, or to repetition, or for someone like me, if I will open my heart to more hymns that I'm not used to, that I didn't grow up with in the Baptist tradition, if I would open my heart up to a new melody, a slower way of singing that I'm not used to, if I would start listening a little bit more to the words and to the Spirit of God in that person as they wrote that song, I think that when I sang worship for those songs that I wasn't particularly fond of because of the style or because of the way it does or handles the words, if I did that, I think that every church service for me would be more fulfilling and help me to become more Christ-like, and I think it can do the same for you. And so I know I'm spending a little bit of time here, and I know it's not part of the sermon. It's a mini sermon before the sermon, but I think it's just important that we talk about it. Does that make sense? Did anybody like the words of that song? Okay, good. That's good. I'm glad that you liked it. The only problem I have with modern worship leaders is they always pick somebody who has a high voice. And then I struggle to sing like that. I need somebody who sings a little bit lower. But anyways, good morning, church.
Good morning.
Turn to your neighbor and say, I'm so happy you're here this morning.
I'm so happy you're here this morning. I'm happy you're back. I'm happy you're back.
And then, I know y'all didn't miss me. It's fine.
No, not at all.
It's okay. Y'all had great people covering. Chris, I heard, was fantastic, and Kevin, who's not here, it's also great. You know what? Let's do that. Let's go ahead and give a round of applause as a thank you to Chris. Thank you. And a thank you for Kevin, because he's not here. Because I'll tell you what, I was thinking about trying to come back from the honeymoon on Saturday, and I'm glad that I didn't, because that would have been really, I would have been very tired. It's a very long flight.
You were preaching in Italian.
No, I didn't learn any Italian. I just learned a few. I learned grazie. It's the only thing I learned. So I don't know about you, but how many of you guys have heard Genesis sermons growing up? Genesis sermons on Genesis. Okay, so not often. Okay, not often. Now, where do most preachers tend to stick? What?
Adam and Eve.
Okay, we'll say that. Let's get off of Genesis for a second. In the Bible, where do most preachers tend to stick? The New Testament. It's so much easier to handle the New Testament. Because, to tell you what, I actually I've taught on the Old Testament a couple of times here, but typically, I'm a big fan of Jesus, so I stick with what Jesus does and teaches in the New Testament. And I know you all are big fans of Jesus too, at least I hope. And I actually texted my Episcopal priest friend and I said, guess what, Isaac? And he said, what? I said, I'm teaching from the Hebrew Bible today. And he goes, I'm so proud of you. And I'm like, thanks. But normally I don't like teaching on Genesis at all. And the reason I don't like teaching on Genesis, worse than Genesis is Leviticus. I do not want to teach on Leviticus. Just because, that just sounds like a bad. I'm gonna do a whole year-long series on Leviticus. Doesn't that sound awful? But
Skip church.
Dawn would be at the beach a lot more often. The reason I don't like teaching on Genesis is because a majority of the times that I've ever heard a sermon on Genesis, where it starts is something along they'll do in the beginning, right? And they'll say, folks, now what we have here is a written history of humanity. They'll say, folks, what we have here is the evolutionist is stupid because it tells us what the Bible wrote. Now, how many of you have heard that sermon before? Okay, most of you, I hope. I mean, because it's that way I don't feel alone in this. When I was in high school, I don't know if you guys remember it because you weren't like, I don't know. I forget sometimes that the church is pretty separated and people see and remember different things. But one of the things I remember when I was in high school was Ken Ham versus Bill Nye. Do you guys remember that? Yes? And I remember thinking at the time, wow, Ken Ham did such a fantastic job. And all of my classmates were like, Bill Nye wiped the floor with Ken Ham. And the funny thing about that is, could you imagine being Ken Ham and being used to wipe the floor by Bill Nye the science guy? What? Ken Ham the creation man? We're going to have to come up with a name. But my point is, there are entire ministries, entire debates, entire churches founded on an inappropriate reading of Genesis. Whew. Did you know, how old is the earth? Does anybody know how old the earth is? 4.5 billion years. No. Well, it's okay. I like you saying 4.5 billion years. That's fine. I don't know how old it is either. I don't really care. But about, I don't know, Frida, when were you in the Southern Baptist Church? We're a small group today. We're Bible studying. You grew up in the Baptist Church, yes? Yeah. When did you stop going to a Baptist church and start attending somewhere else?
It was about mid-teens.
Okay, mid-teens. Okay, so when you were like 12, if you said the earth is 4.5 billion years old, how would have that gone over?
I wouldn't have dared say it. Went to your room without dinner.
In fact, I went to a university that was, in fact, one of the pillars of their faith was a young earth creationism theory, right? We had to sign documents that said that we didn't believe in evolution, basically. And I had conversations with people that said that you couldn't be a true follower of Christ if you believed in evolution. Now, how backwards is that? Pretty backwards. Pretty bad. But my whole point on bringing Genesis up is because not that I necessarily want to go through all of the hermeneutical misinterpretations that we do, right? I don't want to do that. This isn't a Bible lecture. This isn't a college. But I do want to teach a sermon series on Genesis. And I think the reason that it's so important that we see Genesis for what it is holy, holy, holy. Genesis teaches us about ourselves, but it teaches us ultimately about God. When we take Genesis and we say the earth is 6,600 years old, like that, what was his name? I've got it here somewhere. Oh, the Usher Chronology. It was a 17th century chronology of the history of the world, formulated by a literal reading of the Old Testament by a priest. So 17th century really isn't that long ago in the history of the world. In fact, in the history of the Bible, it's really not all that long ago. And he was the one who said, he's one of the major proponents of, the earth is 6,600 years old. When we do that, when we make the earth 6,600 years old, what we're doing is making Genesis 1 about us. We're making it about us because more important than what Genesis teaches us about God is, how old is the earth? How does Genesis 1 relate to me? Can I make Genesis 1 about me by how old the earth is? Yes, you can. You absolutely can. In fact, we're in danger of doing that with the whole Bible, making it about us. You know what the problem was with we actually won't talk about it much, but we'll talk about it next week. Do you know what the problem is with the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Adam and Eve wanted to make it about them. And yet we try and make the Bible about us. And so I wanted to go over a sermon series in Genesis because, Genesis is kind of a cool book. I mean, if you try and read the Old Testament from front to back, not stopping, never, glancing at the New Testament, it might be a little bit hard. Has anyone ever done that? Read the Old Testament front to back without touching the New Testament? Say it out.
It's brutal.
It's brutal. It's brutal. Well, I hope that this sermon series isn't quite as brutal. I guess I should give you the backstory on how I got to come up with, or maybe I didn't come up with it, I don't know, this sermon series. Would you go to that next slide now? They're ready for the pretty church. Okay, this church here. Where is this? Anyone can have a guess? In Italy, because that's where we just were. And one of the things that's really popular to do in Italy is to visit a bunch of churches, right? All of these churches are they're important and influential, and most of Venice is Roman Catholic. Most of Italy is Roman Catholic. And so it seems like, okay, so you know this street right here, 39th? Wait, that's not 39th. 39th?
Yeah.
And you drive from here to 13th. How many churches are there?
20.
Minimum, right?
20.
I mean, you could respectably in one morning walk to 20 churches, right? So imagine that's kind of how all of Venice is. There's like, if you couldn't walk there within a respectable amount of time for Mass, then they put it in another church. I mean, really, that's kind of how it was. And we visited 10 churches. We would have visited more, but that day we walked 12 miles, which I wish I would do more often sometimes. But we walked 12 miles that day visiting these churches, trying to find it on this really poorly drawn up map that the church tour thing gave us. And this was my personal favorite church. And so from the years 1990 to 1997, this church was restored, and it cost $4 million to restore it. The church, so if you see this, got marble slabs. It had salt in all that marble because they didn't have a refining process back then. And it was basically ready to just crumble into powder because the salt was, not as strong as the rest of the elements in the marble. And so they had to take every piece of the church apart and wash it. It was estimated to cost $1 million. It cost $4 million. And people asked me, well, does it seem like anyone's scared of Venice sinking? And I said, no, they spent $4 million on a church. Go to the next slide for me. So this is inside that church. And if you can see those like cross beams that go across? Well, those cross beams they used to have these big wooden panels, painted panels, like a drop ceiling. And those were installed, I think, somewhere in the 16 or 1700s. But the church was actually built in the 1400s. And so in the 1990s, when they went to go restore it and they pulled these panels off to restore them, they discovered original frescoes from the 1400s. And they decided to restore those. And let me tell you why, though, this is my favorite church. So have any of you been to Israel? No. I went with Cedarville when I was in college, and they had this program where I could go for $600 for 10 days. Everything was $600. Yeah, it's for college students. If you know any college students who are Christian and want to go to Israel, it's a really cool program, and they do it at a lot of the colleges. They probably do one at a UF. But when I went there, when I was in school, I was taught kind of a disrespect for liturgy. Do I have to define liturgy? No. For high church, for things like even reciting the Lord's Prayer, that is a very light form of liturgy. I was taught a disrespect for more traditional church. And they might not say that openly, but what I was taught was that if I, in fact, participated in these things, those things would dull my actual perspective and love of Jesus. Because I'm not allowing my heart to craft those responses, or I'm not allowing my heart to be free in a worship service. Instead, it's, timed out. It's the same every week. And so when we went to Israel, as a class, we visited all of these churches. And if you think these are pretty, I didn't show you all the rest. If you think this is pretty, you should see the churches in Israel, because they're just the most ornate churches you've ever seen in your whole life. And there's Greek Orthodox priests walking around in like full garb. And you imagine it's probably what the Pharisees dress like. Like it's pretty crazy. But what I thought when I went to visit those churches was, wow, this is so sad. What? But that's what I was taught. Wow, this is so sad. Why is that so sad? Well, I was taught that it was sad because they were distracting from relationship with religion. That's what I was taught. I was taught that all of this ornate stuff that they were doing, all of these prayers they were saying, all of this idea that if I pray in that building, it's better than if I pray in my home. I was taught that all of that stuff was distracting me from who God really was. And the reason I bring that up is when we went to this church and I was looking at, that's a tambourine. When we went to this church and visited, I realized something, and I bought a postcard because the only postcard I bought this and some Murano Venetian glass pens. So I'm a nerd. This is the only thing really one of the only things I brought home, because as we were in this church, and we had been seeing churches all day, I think this is probably the 4th or 5th church we had been to, I realized something. I realized that these Renaissance artists in the 1400s were simply trying to ascribe honor and glory and power and holiness unto God. If you think about the Pharisees and you think about all of these other religious leaders, typically their garments are ornate. Typically, churches are more ornate than your home. Less so than they used to be. But the reason is because at this time, in the 1400s, this was their way of saying, my God is glorious. My God is powerful. My God has an abundance of wealth and of love, of hospitality, of knowledge. Right? That is the Renaissance artist's idea. Number 2, they had to fill the church with beautiful pictures because a lot of their congregants wouldn't have been able to read. And they couldn't just write holy, holy, holy on the back of a hymnal and stick it in the chair and hope that people could read it. They had to show them the glory of God. In a way, all of our creativeness comes from God. This ascription of holiness and power and love and knowledge and omnipotence, this depiction of God, this depiction of our God, is the same God that we worship today. They just knew how to describe him in a way that we don't know how to. And all of their creativeness as Renaissance artists came from God himself. And the beautiful thing is that we see that creativeness in Genesis 1. We see God speaking and everything coming into existence. You see why, while the artist strokes a paintbrush, God simply speaks. Is that not power? Is that not holiness? In fact, it's been argued that God simply created earth out of an overflowing amount of love. That he was overflowing with love so much that he had to create something. Well, not necessarily, but it followed that he did. Created something. The book of Genesis is about beginnings, about creation, about humanity. And when we hear the word beginning in Genesis 1, we often think it's about the material creation of the universe. And so therefore, when we tend to read it according to the presumptions and assumptions that we have parameters of creation and evolution to live up to. Is Genesis 1 literal history? Is it scientifically accurate? And so with that assumption, we often take Genesis 1 and we make it about us. We misconstrue it. And we say, either modern science is right and the Bible is wrong, or either the Bible is right and modern science is wrong. We see people who read Genesis differently from a literal creation or from a special creation standpoint sometimes as an atheistic tool to tear down Christian culture. I think Christian culture is the operative word, right? Not faith. But what if, in fact, it's about neither of those things? What if, in fact, there's a third direction that we can go with the texts in Genesis? See, the problem with both views is that they both assume that when God inspired Genesis, back then and back there, that he was really addressing the questions that we in the modern world have right here and right now. Neither view takes the time to step back and say, wait, Genesis was originally addressed to ancient people living in ancient Israel and the ancient Near East. How would they have understood it? What is it saying to them? And the fact that the ancient Israelites were not modern people living in our scientific age, they were living in an ancient world surrounded by different cultures and were concerned with a whole different set of questions and issues than we are concerned with today. If you're an ancient Israelite and you heard or read, probably not read, we'll say heard Genesis 1, you would not be thinking, wow, this totally refutes Charles Darwin. And the reason why you would... I can hear people at Cedarville saying, heretic! And the reason why you would not be thinking that is because that's a modern debate. That's a modern debate. The whole canary thing, the whole island thing, that's modern. Ken Ham, that's even more modern than Charles Darwin. How about making Genesis about us, right? That's about our debates, our questions, our understandings. When did we ever ask about God's? So we need to realize the key to understanding Genesis 1, or really anything in the Bible for that matter, is, there's a word I use in most of my sermons that I normally start the sermon with, and it took me a while to get to today. It starts with a C and ends with a T. Context. Context. Thank you, Dawn. I can always count on Dawn for the fill-in-the-blank questions. She's like that one kid in youth group who always raises their hand. The perspective of the original audience we need to ask is, what does it mean to them? We need to get into the sandals of the people of ancient Israel, but don't actually wear sandals. They're a dead fashion trend. Thanks. Laugh. Thanks. There's a reason they call them Jesus sandals, right? And read the Bible from their point of view. From what God inspired, he was first and foremost trying to reveal something in their own culture, in their own situation. And once we do that, we'll be able to truly understand, translate, and apply what God revealed back then to our lives here and now. Genesis would have been widely understood at that time to not be a historical or scientific account. Nobody at that time would have ever thought that this was their science book. Or wait, maybe it is. Let me see. Nope. No. Okay. I've never heard a science book that talks about some guy being hung on a cross. If you read a science book like that, you let me know. Then we'll talk. But, and science doesn't normally talk about love too much. I mean, sometimes it does, emotions, but this isn't a science book. It's not a history book. In fact, it's not a textbook at all. And those people would have understood that. those people would have actually understood Genesis 1 and really the Genesis 1 through 11, they would have understood it to have been myth. Myth. But see, the problem is with using the term myth, because I'm going to address that, because wait, can everyone give me a collective? Myth is that some people immediately think that I'm saying, or that any other person who says it, is saying that Genesis 1 through 11 is not true. Or they're thinking it's not a fairy, or it's a fairy tale. But properly understood, myth is actually a genre. Myth is a genre. Did anybody know that? I found that fascinating the first time I ever heard that myth is a genre. You could thank Peter Enns, I believe. And Peter Enns is my theological crush. And he said something along the lines of that Genesis was a myth. And I was like, oh, what? But it's nothing more than a genre of literature, just like poetry, parables, and histories are distinct genres of literature. And in the ancient world, when people talked about their gods and their views regarding ultimate purpose and meaning, they didn't write histories. They wrote myths. They didn't write histories. They wrote myths. And so Genesis 1 is a myth. That's all to say that at that time they would not have understood that the earth was created in 6 literal days, nor would they would have cared. They wouldn't have been having the debate if the earth was, I guess at that time it would have been, well, how many, I guess it'd still be pretty close to 4.5 billion, if that's what it is, 4.5 billion years old. They would have been like 4.47 billion years old. At that time, right? They wouldn't have cared. They wouldn't have thought that. No one would have said, but look at this rock. Right? Nobody would have even been having or thought to have this debate, because at that time there were a lot of creation narratives. There were a lot of stories, even ones that predate Genesis, that have a very similar storyline and a very similar first 2 characters and a very similar flood. But the difference between those creation stories and our creation stories is that our creation story makes people worthy. Our creation story, and we'll talk about this more as we go throughout the series, our creation story makes the human story worth telling. Our creation story takes a God that could be seen as a watchmaker and makes him come down to the garden. If you were a deist, you could use Genesis 1 to argue that it was true, that God didn't have any role in our lives. But then if you go into Genesis 2, you see him in an anthropomorphic way, walking and talking with his people. God, the glory, the holiness, the abundance, the wealth, the love, the knowledge of God that caused him to simply be able to speak and create. The same thing, the same power, or the same artistic ability that eventually ran into the artists who created these big old scaffoldings, I'm assuming, because that's really high. You can't tell, but it's like twice as high, 3 times as high as this church. The same God who spoke everything into existence comes down and speaks with his people. And so a holy creation has much less to do with the mechanisms in which God created, whether that be an instant creation 6,000 years ago or something over time, or a big bang, or whatever else that you want to believe about the creation of the universe. And frankly, that's a question that I don't really care to answer. I'll just be honest with you. That's something that I don't generally struggle with. I'm not like, well, how old is the earth? You know, I don't think about that very much because I don't really care. I find it inconsequential because Genesis isn't talking about that. Genesis, in the same way that artists are trying to ascribe power and glory and love and abundance and wealth and knowledge onto God, the author of Genesis is doing the same thing by saying God spoke. In my favorite words in Genesis 1, I should say, not only did God speak, but when he spoke and was at the end of whatever day that he was coming to, he saw that it was good. That's pretty powerful if you think about it. Think about the holiness, the love, the power of God from the perspective of that author. He cared about it so much, or she cared about it so much. I can't do patriarchal things up here. But I'll assume, just because of the history of the church and the way that they choose whether or not to keep things in Scripture, that it probably was a male. The author, and by the way, the author of this, of Genesis is not God, it's an author. The author of Genesis wanted so badly for his readers to understand the power and the love and the artistic ability of God that he chose actually to avoid, whether it was 6,000 years old or 4 billion years old. He chose to avoid the scientific question. Nobody at this, because he could have wrote a history. He really could have. He could have claimed that this was a literal history of the creation of the world. But he didn't. He wrote it as a myth for a reason. So his readers, whether it be back then or now, and we have a harder time with it now than they did back then, would understand the exact same thing that that artist, though not God, but had artistic ability, that artist was trying to ascribe to God. And take it one step further. If the author of Genesis is right, and I do believe that he is, in ascribing honor and power and glory and wealth and love and knowledge onto God, then just like this artist is trying to teach us about God, his congregants about God, through these paintings, the ones who couldn't read, the ones that were trying to show power, or he was trying to show power and love and honor and glory through his creation in this. Take the greatest artist of all time, God, and see what he's doing with his creation. If he's ascribing power and glory and honor and wealth and power and love onto God, and you step out of your house one clear night and you look up at the stars, you know that feeling you get? Most of you have that feeling, right? I'm not alone in this, that you step out and you look up at the stars and you say, wow. And it might be a combination of how pretty it is. It might just be how pretty it is. It might be, I'm very small. It might be a mixture of the two. But just like this artist ascribes all of those qualities onto God, and this author of Genesis 1 attempts to do that as well through saying God spoke. God actually does it. God actually does it. You step out and you see the stars and you look up into the sky and you say, I'm so small, but God still loves me. That's absolutely beautiful. And your heart is ascribing power and love and honor and glory onto God. Amen?
Amen.
Where's the most beautiful place in the world that you've ever been? Shout it out. The Springs? We love the Springs. Especially Crystal River. Ireland. New Mexico. Where else?
Georgia says
Disney. That was a good answer. Disney. What else? The mountains. Okay.
I gotta say Italy.
Italy. Where else? Come on, you guys have been everywhere. You're world travelers.
The Blue Ridge Mountains.
The Blue Ridge Mountains are a beautiful place. I do love the mountains. That's why I struggle with living in a place that's so flat, like Gainesville. But my point is that each of those things, for us as individuals, really, because they connect with us, ascribe honor and power and glory and love and abundance unto God, and they should. The author of Genesis 1, he starts that conversation by saying, God spoke, and it was good. And our response to Genesis 1 shouldn't be, is the earth 6,000 years old or 4.5 billion years old? Are Adam and Eve literal people? Is it supposed to be just a man and a woman? Does that describe marriage? It's supposed to be none of that. Our response to God spoke should be nothing less than adoration. When I walked into that church and I saw that painting, I thought, well, those multiple paintings, I thought, wow, this artist was really talented. Wow, he's really trying to depict God in this way. We can say the same thing about Genesis, right? The way that he describes God, God spoke. And then we can look at the art itself, and the same awe factor that we have with certain passages in the Bible, or we have with pretty things like this. Amplify that when we see his creation. Everything that you look at, see, touch, smell, taste. And I said, did I say feel? Everything you feel comes from God. God spoke. And so when we step out into those places, or we step into those relationships, or we get that hug, or we don't go to bed angry since I'm newly married, it should cause nothing but adoration. You see, just like the author of Genesis knew to use myth to ascribe glory and holiness, and just like this author used, or this artist knew to use ornateness to ascribe glory, and just like God knew to use creation to ascribe glory, we ought to use our harps to do the same. So now that I'm down here, I'm going to go back up here because I don't feel particularly tall when I'm down there. This makes me feel a little taller. Next week, we're going to be talking, we're going to take it a step further, we're going to be talking about a holy people. And I have another story from Italy that I'm going to be using in that, but we're going to be talking not about people who are holy like the Southern Baptists. Ha! I sometimes feel bad about poking so much fun, but I can't do that because I'm still so... You guys remember Isaac from the wedding, my Episcopalian friend? He tells me all the time that I'm still so Southern Baptist, and I know that I am. But I'm just not in all the right ways, I think. But anyways, we're going to be focusing on how God made us holy, how we bear his image. And that's going to be a fun time that I think will probably be one of my favorite messages throughout this series. And so I look forward to seeing everyone next week. And as we go into this next, we're going to pray. And then as we go into this next song, the song is called You're Beautiful. It's been out quite a long time. And I would like you to stand and sing because, or sit and sing, that's fine too. I'm going to stand and sing. But you can sit and sing. But regardless of how you feel your voice sounds, or whether or not you feel like you like the music or you like the song, take in, listen to, and project those words out to God in adoration as an overflowing of your heart, thanking him for what he did when he spoke, because it is good. Would you pray with me? Dear Heavenly God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to gather together. We thank you that we got to be here this morning together to look at who you are together and to start this series about your holiness. Father, as we go into this week, God, would you help us, like a mother, holding us and loving us and showing us who you are in your creation. Surround us with your beauty and help us to have a heart full of adoration, because we know, God, that there are so many things that distract us. There are so many things that are challenging to us as followers of God. There are so many things that are challenging to us simply as people. There are things that draw our heart away from you, God, but we pray for your help and your assistance in drawing our heart nearer to you every day. With your heads bowed and your eyes closed, would you slip your hand up in the air if you know that you could be doing a better job with adoration of God in his creation? If you know that in your relationships, in the place you're at right now, whether that be here in church or the place you're at when you're at work or the place you're at when you go on vacation, that you could be looking at everything with wonder and adoration because God spoke. Keep your hand in the air and pray this with me. Father, help me.
Father, help me.
Well, you don't have to say it out loud, but you can if you want. Help me to have a heart full of adoration. Help me to see your artwork everywhere that I go. And help me to realize the glory, the honor, the power, the wealth, the abundance, and the knowledge that you spoke into your creation. The way that is ascribed to you. And God, change my heart. Pull it away from distractions and pull it into yourself. Help me to have a heart that sees your love in absolutely everything that you've done and everything that happens around me. We ask all this in your holy, your heavenly, your almighty name. Amen.